This is not going to be very cogent because my verbal facilities are impaired in the morning, mainly due to lack of caffeine. Uh, so, at any rate, let's go forth. I faced the same condition for 20 years as a physics tutor at the University of Washington Instructional Center, and I did some mathematic tutoring during the summer there upstairs. And I picked up physics during this, engineering during this 20-year period as well. So I taught undergraduate engineering and undergraduate physics. I did workshops and stuff like that as well. So I'm just doing some early morning musings on cruel and unusual punishment. Uh, Now, I'm not going to talk about the main kind, the kind which occurs in death penalty cases, etc. Nor am I going to talk about which has to do. First of all, let's outline what cruel and unusual punishment is. Cruel and unusual punishment that outlines the envelope is described in as a three-tier pronouncement by the Supreme Court in the case Ingraham versus Wright, 1977. The first tier just has to do with the kind of laws, the kind of punishments, rather, that can be imposed and that they can't be insensible to our the propriety of society, generally speaking, that they must be subjected to the evolving sense of decency that our society, not societies in general, have. And this rules out types of punishments such as being chained to a post in the sun for 7 hours, which is a Philippine law. I think it was Weems around 1907. Philippines being under the auspices of the United States Constitution, um, SCOTUS came into play. So you can't chain somebody to a post for 7 hours in the sun. You can't tar and feather people. You can't stone. No, some of this hasn't been ruled upon, but let's just say that it would be reasonable to suppose that the Constitution of the United States forbids governments, states. In 1962, the Eighth Amendment conditions were imposed upon every state. Federally, the federal Eighth Amendment conditions were uh, translated as state responsibilities by the case California. I mean, Robinson v. California. So no state can do this. And generally speaking, laws are written by states and cities therein. So states. City lawmaking is the same as state lawmaking. So anyway, so neither the state nor the Fed can say tar and pillar somebody or stone somebody to death or like the probably most forms of torture, um, as outlined by various I don't know entities that try to protect people all throughout the United States. I mean, throughout the world, are forbidden, such as you can't cause somebody to suffer from exposure to the elements. That's a form of torture. You must have somebody protect from the elements according to the Geneva Convention. Um, anyway, so this is, of course, the U.S. is not under um, any obligation to adhere to these um, main things. But okay, so there are three tiers. Three tiers. of cruel and unusual punishment. 3 different kinds of cruel and unusual punishment, according to the Fed. Cruel and unusual punishment and case law, Scottish case law. The first has to do with the kind of punishment that can be imposed by the state against somebody. Second has to do with the proportionality, the durative severity, generally speaking, for imposing, a law against somebody. Now, okay, that's the category. Okay, now of course there's all sorts of arguments between various Supreme Court justices as to whether or not this indeed exists, or if it does exist, how much it exists. There's no question among Scottish individual justices about whether proportionality itself exists. What the question is whether it comes under cruel and unusual punishment, or if the origins of proportionality considerations lie elsewhere, like the Magna Carta, as opposed to the English Bill of Rights of 1689, which is where cruel and unusual punishment comes from, is cruel and illegal punishment, or cruel and unusual punishment. This is brought by the English Parliament, demand to the new king and queen king of 1689, after the old king died, in response to some particular heinous forms of punishment that were imposed on some people, like Titus Oates, before that. So there's no question that in the case law since then, excuse me, Scottish has made its various pronouncements about that. And in most cases, they say proportionality does exist. I believe that Scalia said that proportionality does not exist outside of death penalty cases. In other words, the differentiation between, say, a severe penalty, a felonious crime of doing, say, 10 years and 20 years is not recognized by any of the Supreme Court justices ever. That's a state prerogative by the 10th Amendment. The states can impose, one state can impose a 10-year fine, a neighboring state can impose a 30-year fine, jail sentence for the same crime so up to the states. But for the death penalty, proportionality, it does exist. Every justice says so, except for Justice Thomas, who has said that it doesn't exist at all under the Eighth Amendment. Now, whether it exists elsewhere or under the Eighth Amendment is irrelevant. Ingraham Wright says that it exists. So that's the second tier. The first tier is the kind of punishment allowable. The second tier is the proportionality of the punishment relative to the crime. And the third tier is that, I'm just going to quote Ingraham Wright, is that, quote unquote, cruel and unusual punishment imposes substantive limits on what can be made criminal and punished as such. So it imposes limits on what laws can be made that have punishments. If a law has no punishment, any law presumably could be made. But in reality, every law has punishments. Why do laws have punishments? Okay, now let's go into talking about the perspective of a scientist of how society works. So let's look at the two-state model. So we have the state and we have the people. Okay, so the people elect a government, people to represent them, and the government has a legislative body to write laws, and these laws are necessary because society itself is evolving, as well as the environment that society lies within. You have society and the environment. This is an analytic perspective that comes from the sciences. You isolate the system from its environment and you analyze the system. And this applies to every science except for cosmology, in which case the system and the environment are the same thing. And this applies to systems analysis as well in engineering. Uh, this applies to computer science, everything. So we have the system and the environment. Okay, so society evolves with respect to itself. The individual elements or entities of society are people. The way people interact with each other uh, changes the overall structure of society. And so this two-state model, you have the state and the people. And the state writes laws, makes laws for the people. Why does it do this? It does this so that civil order um, and exists and people can have good lives without destroying each other or killing each other or breaking into factions which destroy each other or kill each other. It's a stable system that persists over time, over, centuries. So, all right. Now, how do laws work? So the state makes a law. It's legislated, it's signed, etc. It comes into being, and now the people are supposed to follow this law. Okay, the law has something called a legislative purpose, meaning the reason that it was written. It has this legislative purpose has to do with how society interacts with itself and its environment in the future. And how are legislative purposes enacted by law? Well, they're published online, internet, whatever, these days, and read by people, and word of mouth spreads. When a new law is written, often people get ticketed because they don't know it exists. For example, an anti-smoking ordinance here in Fort Collins. A lot of people got ticketed. There's a lot of bars, and people are smoking outside of bars, and the cops are giving tickets for a period of time. And that's a way of informing the public that the law exists. And then once it's known that it exists, it's widely known, people either follow or don't follow the law. Okay. If they follow the law, they presumably advance the interest of the government in their legislative intent, the reason for them making the law. That's almost always the case. The law has a reason for being made. Otherwise, it's a stupid law. There aren't that many stupid laws. There are stupid people making laws, but there aren't a lot of stupid laws. Okay, sorry about the background noise. My alarm's going off. I woke up a little bit early. All right, so let's see if I can ignore that freaking noise. All right, so excuse me, I'm gonna go shut that. All right, so let's see. We were getting at a scientific perspective meaning from the perspective of a scientist, uh, how laws function, etc. Um, Here's another scientific perspective. This would be a biological perspective, um, and a computer science perspective. There are systems which have intelligence built in to them. Speaking of biological systems, we're all familiar with ant colonies, very large collections of ants that behave more intelligently than any individual ant um, could manage to cause into being the structuralized behavior of the colony. Um, Now let's speak of plants because nobody, I mean, not very many people think about plants as being intelligent, and yet plant systems behave intelligently. Um, let's talk about. There's something called the uh, Wood Wide Web, WOODWIDE web. In which case, I mean, which has been this term has been around for over 10 years. Uh, let's speak about mimosa plants. Mimosa plants have leaves, and if a ant bite is coming up and biting some kind of insect that is bad for the plant, the leaf will close up. How does it do this? The water goes down the stem, which closes the leaf up in response to this. So it has a minimally intelligent response. But if you have a field of mimosa leaves and you have the right kind of fungal system underneath them, these fungal systems are present in uh, most ecosystems. And the fungal system allows the individual plants to communicate through the fungus. The fungus goes up, it provides nutrients to the plant. It also removes some nutrients for itself. And this provides a chemical signaling component. Well, if you have a plant here which is being bitten, and there's another plant here, the leaves here close. The leaves here will close. It will know the presence of the bug over here. How? Through the fungal system, which is called the Wood Wide Web. So this is a kind of intelligence which is imposed upon ecosystems, which the individual nodes or plants in and of themselves are not very intelligent. One would argue they're not intelligent at all. They have no neurons. But they do have behaviors that are adaptive, that are also quick acting in a temporal or time manner, speaking with mimosa leaves closing like this. There are also slower effects. So, ants have neurons, but they're not very bright. But they form bridges made out of the bodies that are adaptive. All sorts of adaptive mechanisms. They harvest leaves, some of them that make mulch, that use a higher entire city underground that has garbage ants that collect garbage and put them in deep pits and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very organized city of ants. And no ant, not even the queen, is smart enough to create this organization. And the organization itself represents intelligence. So I'm claiming that laws do similar things. They're a network of rules which govern the behavior of the individual nodes or people who exist in society. And so they provide intelligence to the society that otherwise wouldn't be there, which creates the society adheres as a whole, persisting through time, which otherwise it could have factioned into individual elements which further faction or which are oppose each other, and one element might destroy the other, warfare, etc. So, all right, so laws hold society together. There's the people and the state. This basic two element system. um, so in that way, society evolves to changes in itself and its environment in an intelligent way that allows it to survive and the people to thrive within it. Okay, and that's what laws are basically. The, the people are orchestrated by the state. The state orchestrates the people, sort of like a musical conductor. You know, each and every law does this. Okay, supposedly, this is the theory. Okay, from a scientific perspective, it's my theory, true, but it's a theory. Now, what would happen? Now, why do people obey laws? Okay, so what incentivizes people to comply with laws? Now, generally speaking, I won't say that there's an incentive. There's rather a disincentive to to violate laws. The disincentive is the penalty and the fines written within the laws, made within the laws. This disincentivizes the populace from violating the law. You don't want to get caught and pay a fine or do jail time after getting caught. So, um, now let's talk about law efficiency, the efficiency of a law. Now, a law would be efficient if it's obeyed, right? If you're the state, the government, and you want to make a law, you have a legislative purpose for making a law. You want this purpose to be uh, come into fruition. You want changes to be enacted in such a way that your purpose manifests itself. So, how does that happen? It's by people. Well, first of all, it's by good law design and by people following the laws. Now, you could have a hidden purpose. You may want to have a bad law and have people do the opposite. And in which case your disincentivization could be made into the law of the words of the law. Now, that's generally not the case, but just saying it could happen. So, from a scientific perspective, we have to look at the legislative branch of the government as if it were a bunch of monkeys on a typewriter randomly typing out words. And some of those words are cogent, and some of these cogent pieces of words make sentences. Some of them make paragraphs, some of them make laws. Some of the laws have penalties, some of them don't. The laws which have no penalties have no effect, generally speaking. And now let's look at the set of gibberish made by random monkeys at typewriters, which have meaning and have penalties. Okay, now, looking at it from that perspective is the most general way to look at things, and that's the scientific way of looking at things. It's the mathematical way of looking at things. You're looking at boundary conditions, like what could or could not happen, right? So it's the logical way of looking at things, at least from first principles. So, okay, now let's look at the third tier of Ingraham Wright. Cruel and unusual punishment imposes substantive limits on what can be made criminal and punished as such. Now, this tier arose from the English Bill of Rights of 1689. There were restrictions on the English government on what it could do to its people, but these restrictions that arise from considerations after 1689 and cruel and unusual punishment in England. what these restrictions are was on the judiciary, the kinds of punishments that they could impose. And there's the hanging judge who got Titus Oates. He stripped him of his clerisy, of his clerical robes. Now that was an overstep. That's the kind of thing that the judiciary couldn't do. The secular judiciary couldn't do that. The ecclesiastical judiciary could do that. But this judge, the hanging judge, overstepped his authority and did that. Now, it was the intent of the United States government when it came up with the, cruel and unusual punishment clause in the Bill of Rights, speaking of like the late 1700s. It wasn't ratified until the mid 1800s, but many states had it, like the state of Virginia is considered to be an example state. I think 7 states had it, 5 rigorously. It was the intent of these states, state governments, to restrict the authority of governments on the type of and severity of crimes that can be imposed upon the people. But not, and that's the first criterion, right? But not only that, the kind of laws that can be made. And why that? Well, because there was no case law in the United States, it couldn't really impose restrictions upon case law. The judiciary are bound by case law precedent. There's no way to impose restrictions upon the judiciary, so they imposed restrictions upon the legislative branch. And in reality, I mean, the judiciary and the legislative branch work hand in hand. We're talking about laws and punishments. The legislative branch comes up with the laws and the punishments, and these are useless unless the judiciary imposes the will of the legislative branch upon the people so that the laws are followed and the punishments imposed. If the punishments are never imposed, there's no incentive to follow the law. And the behavior of people is, generally speaking, they go about their day, they are only interested in incentives or disincentives. The law disincentivizes people from certain acts and behaviors. So, all right. So there we go. This is sort of a scientific perspective. So it's important to craft laws which, have appropriate punishments and which are orchestrate the people to behave in cogent ways. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about the vast wasteland, which is this third tier of cruel and unusual punishment, because there's really not much which is the case precedent is not much about it, right? There's California there's Robinson versus California in 1962, in which the Supreme Court said that the California state law, it shall be illegal to be addicted to the use of narcotics, is cruel and unusual punishment. This kind of law can't be made. Okay. The analysis of the Supreme Court, basically, most justices were swayed by considerations about personal responsibility, about the ability to conform to a law which can't be conformed to, a person shouldn't be subjected to. The Supreme Court wrote, one of the justices, one opinion, that imposing even one day in jail for the crime of having the common cold would be cruel and unusual punishment. So the analysis of the court was pretty much divided into something called statuses and conditions. So they were swayed by what they called a status or a condition. A condition would be like an illness. So they were talking about people shouldn't be punished for having illnesses that they have had no control over having contracted or were born with, or a person's status, which they have no control over having acquired or been born with. So, what is a status? A status is basically a state of being which is widely recognized by society. So, is homelessness a status? Or is homefulness a status? The answer to the first question, according to the Society of Facebook Users, is yes. And the second question, no. How do I know this? Well, because Facebook has a spell checker, if you go onto Facebook and type homeless, and then type homeful, you will see that one is underlined in red and the other is not. So the one underlined in red is misspelled. Which one is that? It's homeful. The one underlined in red is homeless. Now, if you're a homeless person and you have a camping ticket and you want to fight it, and you have a lawyer, and you want to do a Martin Boise type of argument, say, for example, it is really important to establish the fact that homeless is a status. And judges throughout the history of homeless camping laws are either, some of them have been quite dumb or simply anti-homeless, and they have ruled that homelessness is not a status in various cases. The main cases are the main pro-homeless cases are like Jones v. California or Pottinger versus Miami. In those cases, the judges have correctly, as we have just proven by using Facebook, ruled that homelessness is a status. In other cases, judges have been less willing to accept this, and in some cases, very anti-homeless. In other cases, just stupid. They're not able to evaluate these kinds of conceptual ideas, I guess. So, anyway. All right, so homelessness is an example of a kind of status. Addiction to narcotics is another example of a kind of status. Having the common cold and being serving 1 day in jail is an example of cruel and unusual punishment. It's not proportionality, as noted. Well, it may not be proportionality, as noted by Scalia in another case, which has to do with proportionality. This case, Scalia mentioned this thing in Robinson that I just mentioned about having a common cold. Okay. Now that's about it as far as case law. And there's Powell v. Texas, 1968. It's the next important case up the chain. And that was a case in which there's a guy named Powell who was an alcoholic. He had a family. He had children. He lived in a small town in Texas. This town had an anti-public intoxication ordinance, so it made it illegal to be intoxicated in public. And Powell, good old Powell, got himself a ticket for being intoxicated in public. Now, the record, by the time something reaches the Supreme Courts, the facts have been well established. The record does not indicate whether or not Powell had another place other than public property to be intoxicated. In other words, whether he was homeless or not. It did establish that he had a wife and kids. They presumably lived in a home, but it didn't establish whether Powell lived in that home with him. And if it had been established that Powell was homeless, it would have changed the history of Scottish precedent because Powell was a 414 tie as to whether this kind of law is cruel and unusual punishment, to whether alcoholics have the right to drink on public property. And the answer would have been yes if Powell were homeless. Because at the very least, Justice White would have voted that way, as he indicated in his opinion in this case. So, okay. So now, what about camping? So, I'm just sort of widening the circles in perspective. So, as I said, I'm going to produce a novel argument. And novel arguments, by the way, in law are frowned upon. It's an insult if they say, is in response to an argument of one side, the other side says, the first side has this novel argument. You're trying to sway the judge into having an unfavorable opinion about this argument. Because in the law, precedent is like by far the most important thing. And what has happened in the past, repeating what happened in the past, ideas and considerations and stuff like that in rulings, is of the highest, most important. And there's something called judicial restraint, where the judge must restrain him or herself to make the minimal, most incremental leaps in sort of conceptual advances on or viewpoint changes on cases or types of cases. Not cases, but types of cases. So anyway, so it's kind of the opposite of like academia. And yet, laws in academic subjects. So it's kind of like these internal stresses exist. So when I say novel argument, if you're a lawyer, of course, you'll know that's not a good thing. And yet, if you're interested in academic advances or perspective changes, Weltanschauung shifts, we're talking about anyway, that would be a good thing. So if you're a smart lawyer, there's all kinds of smart lawyers. But what I mean is if you're a lawyer, it's smart of you to know everything that you can about particular kind of law that you practice. So it's good to know these arguments exist in case they might be used by you fruitfully in the future. So I'm going to advance an argument which is different than Martin Boise for Collins City Ordinance 17181, in that it imposes cruel and unusual punishment upon the homeless people of its populace. So the argument basically has to do with the way society works, and that it's a proper disincentivization of laws is really important. Laws don't work. One could define the efficiency of law as like the percentage of people who ordinarily follow laws would follow this particular law, right? So it's like one does, one doesn't. sort of like dielectrics in a liquid or something, subjected to a magnetic force, or something like electron spins, a magnetic force, right? They flip around in a thermal bath, right? Heated, right? So some of them are up, some are spin down, some are spin up. But in general, and of course, this is we're talking quantum states here. So what am I talking about? Okay, all right. So nobody's gonna understand this or understand the law. So like the percentage of people who comply with the law, ordinarily speaking, if it's 80%, it's a law which is relatively efficient. If nobody ever complies with the law's legislative purpose never gets enacted. Society never changes in the way that was wanted. It doesn't adapt to itself or its surroundings. It doesn't. It, anyway, so efficient laws are laws which are obeyed. Laws which are obeyed have they're incentivized well. If the punishment now, let's talk about post-convicted punishment versus pre-convicted punishment. I'm going to introduce the novel concept of pre-convicted punishment by law. Okay, we're looking at the state people model, right? So the state makes law, the people adopt to the law, they learn it and they comply with it or they don't comply with it. All right, so the intent of the punishment of the law, the post-convicted punishment, is to get people to comply with the law. It disincentivizes people. Okay. Now, what if a law has verbiage in it such that the people who, by complying with the law, act as unofficial agents of the state to create the changes, want the desirable changes? What if the words tell the people that they should do something which is more punishing than the worst possible punishment, post-convicted punishment written into the law itself? What would they do? You know, um, I mean, for example, a city could write a law which has a speed limit minimum instead of maximum. You know, say the city has, means it's for this overall safety of people that the speed limit is a maximum, but you could have a law which makes it illegal to go less than 70 miles per hour as opposed to over 70 miles per hour. What if some city has a law which makes it illegal to go less than 35 miles per hour, say? So that way everything hops and everything runs cool and everybody likes it. Well, what about going around a corner, right? Or what about like if there's a stop sign, and stoplights? What's going to happen? Well, people are going to run stop signs and stoplights. Okay, suppose you say, okay, make it legal to go less than 35 miles per hour if you're within 200 feet of a stop sign or stoplight. Okay, fine. But still, you're going to get situations perhaps where it's icy or where people with poor reflexes who are very old and feeble get into accidents. And some of the people may not want to do that, and it will kill some people. So some people will die because of this law, right? So this is an unsafe law which creates a hazardous condition. It imports hazard into society. So, all right. Now, what about a camping law that makes it illegal to use shelter? Like, okay, I'm going to go over the definition of camping here in Fort Collins. Camping is Fort Collins City Ordinance 17-181. And within it, it says camping shall mean one. Well, it doesn't say one, it has a comma. It's a colon. Camping shall mean. No, it doesn't have a colon. It just says camping shall mean. But I'm going to make it easy. I'm gonna partition it into clauses, which is a process called separating. by the process, a process which is called severing, which is not always possible, but Scottus acts as if it is always possible. And to anyway, so breaking into clauses that don't exist in the law itself. But well, let me just go with the strict verbiage of the law, the way it's written. Camping shall mean to sleep, to spend the night, to reside or dwell temporarily, with or without bedding or other camping gear, and with or without shelter, or to perform activities of daily living, such as eating or sleeping at such place, period. Camping shall not include incidental napping or picnicking. So that's the entire definition of camping. It begins with camping shall mean, right? I can't do double because of this, right? Camping shall mean, which I find highly offensive when I first read that, because what is meaning? Meaning is interpretation, right? It's a post-interpretive thing. The city can't tell me what camping means. The city can tell me what camping is defined to be. If it wants to tell me what camping means, it's done a damn poor job. It needs to explain itself. And there's 3 judges here. There's the chief judge. I don't think they know what the hell it means. It's because it's so broad that they haven't really defined it well. I've caused quite a bit of commotion to this city, only about camping for a while. And in response to something that I did, to a case that I had or something, I always got tickets. So I was the criminal. The city actually, during one day, had it handed out to the homeless people who were getting tickets and who were being arraigned what camping means to the judiciary, a set of acts. I never got a hold of this slip of paper. I just heard that it had happened right after one of my tickets. Anyway, so camping doesn't mean anything. Camping, the meaning of camping is individualized to the person who interprets a definition. That's what it means to them, and the uh, the harmonization of these various meanings in some sort of plane in which they're all sort of almost the same is something that's indicative of good legislation. If that legislation doesn't import meaning to minds transmitted vis-a-vis information and information theory, communications theory, etc., if the various minds have different ideas or concepts of what a particularized set of words mean, then you're not transmitting the same information to people. This process is called fair notice. It applies not only to the people who must comply with the law, but to the police who must enforce the law. It's generally the biggest target of laws is the police rather than the populace. And to the judiciary, who must evaluate whether or not the law has been complied with. Right? So it informs many people. So I'm going to take a small break. I'll be back in 2 minutes. Okay, so basically, I'm claiming, um, excuse me, that Fort Collins City Ordinance 17181 is not properly disincentivized because following the law is torturous in that many of the acts indicated by the law, um, com- if one complies with these the demand by the city to perform these acts, one is torturing oneself. And so, therefore, people who act as unofficial agents of the state to um, affect the legislative changes desired by the government are disincentivized or unable, in many cases, to comply with the law. So let's give an example. To eat, let's say you're a homeless person. You're not allowed on private property unless somebody who owns private property guests you or hosts you, LCD, disobeying Fort Collins City Ordinance 1740, which is trespassing. Okay, that means you're stuck on public property. Now, it makes it illegal to eat on public property, right? Eating on public property is camping. So, where are you going to eat if you can't eat on private property? You can't eat on public property. Well, you can't eat in the city unless you're so fortunate as to have actually gained access to a homeless shelter for the night. Then you could eat within the homeless shelter. Okay, well, there are about 7 times as many. I can't prove this, but there are about 7 times as many homeless people as shelter space dedicated to the homeless by the city of Fort Collins, in the city of Fort Collins. Now, the official numbers are provided by the government. The official numbers are given by the HUD pit count. And the HUD pit count is about 2 to 1. There are twice as many homeless people as shelter space. So we got to work with that. All right, well, still, if that ratio is true, that means the probability of any individual homeless person getting into a shelter at any given night is about 33%. So that means 2 nights out of 3, you've got to spend outdoors. Okay, well, you don't have the money to buy a house. Why? Because you're homeless. You don't have the money to buy a trailer. Why? Because you're homeless. You don't have the money for a hotel. Why? Because you're homeless. If you had enough money to spend every night in a hotel, you would not be homeless. Although many homeless people spend their night, every night in a hotel. They they gang together in groups of 4 or 5, and they hold signs, and they get enough money to live life that way. And HUD declares them homeless, so they're considered to be homeless. But we're not talking about those people because those people don't get camping tickets, generally speaking. It's the people who get camping tickets in Fort Collins are people who generally spend the night in their cars or on public property, like, or on private residential property, like churches. In the city of Fort Collins, it is illegal for a church to allow or permit, the word from the law is to permit, a homeless person to camp on church property on the outdoor side of the church. It's even illegal to allow homeless people to sleep outside of churches. But this isn't enforced because the policemen don't see it and they don't interpret it that way. But the words of the law are very clear. It makes it illegal for people to be inside of domiciles or churches and to camp. It's illegal for me to be drinking my coffee right now because drinking is a form of ingestion. There's some cream in here, so it could be considered that I'm eating. Right now, I'm in my own apartment and I'm eating, so I'm camping. That's illegal because 17182A doesn't have home interior exclusionary clause. Now, it's only illegal insofar as I'm using the textualist version of this law. That's a Scalia type of interpretation. But the reason that this must be done is because the word camping has no bearing on what the colloquial camping has nothing to do with Fort Collins camping, and it's really misleading to use the word. So camping, colloquial speaking, what is camping? It's to occupy a camp. Every dictionary I've ever come across, and I've looked at dozens. Well, I've looked at about 15. I've looked at British dictionaries and I've looked at English dictionaries that date from around 1910. I've looked at all sorts of other types of dictionaries. And in every case, with no exceptions, the definition of camping is to occupy a camp. The only exception I've found to this, I've also looked at the many laws. As I said, I did a survey of the fourth largest cities of all 50 states and their camping laws. The only one that doesn't adhere to this generalized principle of defining camping is Fort Collins. Within the city of Fort Collins, there's no definition of camp. There's only a definition of camping. And the definition of camping is to do one of four verbs. It's to exercise a verb, to sleep, to spend the night, to reside or dwell temporarily, to perform activities of daily living. So in the city of Fort Collins, camping is just to exercise a verb, irregardless of whether or not you happen to be fixed relative to the ground when you exercise this verb. It's not to occupy a fixed GPS location like a camp. It's to exercise a verb. So driving down College Avenue would be camping. Now, why do I say it's camping? Because certainly most people don't import this. This is an interpretation. I'm importing meaning upon this word, camping. Well, the reason I do this is because by the laws of of judicial construction, which judges must use, this is a technical phrase. So that means that a textualist interpretation vis-a-vis like what Scalia said should always be the case, that textualism should be employed, meaning that, by the way, there's all sorts of, what is plain language? Well, there's all sorts of Supreme Court pronouncements about what plain language is, but the version that I'm talking about is textualism, and there's a Supreme Court pronouncement which says that every word must be given import as to its plain language meaning, and that no words shall be ignored. Every word paid attention to, ignoring no words. Every word is important. So, and camping is simply to exercise one of the four verbs: eat, spend the night, reside or dwell temporarily, or to perform activities of daily living, irregardless of your location within the city, or whether you're moving or not within the city. It's illegal to sleep on the bus in the city. This is enforced. If you sleep on the bus driver will wake you up and shout at you. He'll stop the bus. Why? Because presumably sleeping is camping, to sleep. That's the first verb. Doesn't matter whether you're moving or not. Another perspective on this is, since the word camp, which is central to every definition of camping anywhere in the world except for Fort Collins, is not defined in the Code of Fort Collins. We're talking about section 17, which is miscellaneous here. 17X is the camping laws. There's no definition of camp. Well, what is a camp? A camp, if you don't define camping vis-a-vis camp, and camp is not defined, one must work backwards to, if one's going to employ the word camp effectually or effectively, and say, what the hell is this thing? Because the word camping is defined so aberrantly as to be a technical phrase by plain language. What must camp be? Well, let's work backwards. Let's define camp as a place where camping is done. Now let's look at Fort Collins City Ordinance 17-181 and look for places, because that is the only possible camps. So, well, what place does 17-181 refer to? Well, within the definitional section, which is the second and third sentences, it refers to such place. Okay, well, what is such place? Well, the word such has us looking for places that occurred prior to the placement of the word such in all of the text before it. And there is only one place. There's only one possibility. That's public property. So within 17-181, such place, which is our camp, is public property. So that means that there is only one camp, and that camp is public property. So it doesn't matter whether you're driving on College Avenue and eating Cheetos, that would be camping because you're eating, and eating is camping. You're eating on public property in Fort Collins at such place. Such place is public property. So anyway, I'm using textualism here because there's no way to understand this law without using it, because it's so aberrant. It defies the mind's sensibilities as being a human being about what it means to be human and what governments are allowed to do to us. Because just read, it just makes it illegal to be homeless. It's just like, not only that, it calls for the immediate extermination of homeless people by the homeless people. It calls for suicide. It gets really cold here right now. It's 5F. Okay, it's the middle of the day. It's not almost, what time is it? It's 8:30 a.m. here in Fort Collins, and it's 5 degrees out. So, okay, let's say you want to spend the night outdoors. It's 5 degrees out. What are you going to do? Well, you're not allowed. Camping shall mean to sleep, spend the night, reside, or dwell temporarily for activities that they live in. But with or without bedding, other camping gear, or shelter. So that means if it doesn't matter whether you use bedding, camping gear, or shelter, you are still camping. All right, so it's illegal to use shelter. It's illegal to use bedding. It's illegal to use camping gear. Why? Because that would be with, and that would be camping. So that means that you just have to kill yourself by exposure to the elements, which is a form of torture, right? I mean, it makes it illegal to survive the night. All right, so anyway, so getting back to cruel and unusual punishment, here is my argument for a novel argument, which I know if you're a lawyer is bad, but I think it should be presented because another thing that Ingraham Wright said is that this thing should be used sparingly. This third tier condition on cruel and unusual punishment. When was this pronouncement made? 1977. When did Robinson happen? It was 1962. Powell happened 4 years later, 6 years later, 1968. Is that sparingly? Well, the Supreme Court allowed it. So is 6 years sparingly? Yeah, it's fairly sparingly actually. So if you look at the sheer number of cases which the Supreme Court heard versus didn't hear during that period of time. So we're talking about proportionality here, not in terms of cruel and unusual punishment type of proportionality, but in terms of mathematical proportionality here. So I don't know what that number is, but I know what it is today. The Supreme Court hears 70 cases on average each year and has 7,000 requests each year for cases to be heard. So that's a 1%. The Supreme Court hears 1%, right? Did I do this math right? Yeah. 1% of the cases that come to it that for people who, want to be heard. That's a pure mathematical proportionality, 1%, right? 1 divided by 100. So what does sparingly mean in Ingraham, right? Well, sparingly could mean 1%. It could mean, it could be just in sheer fractions of numbers. Sparingly also could be, and I think this is the meaning generally given import by judges and lawyers, is for periods of time, right? Like 1 out of every 100 years is sparingly. It's been, since 1962, it's been 60 years. I would say that that's sparingly too. 1 out of 60 years is sparingly. But if you look at it in terms of sheer cases that have come before the Supreme Court, in terms of mathematical proportionality by number, it's even less than that. So I would think that it's reasonable to assume that as many cases as occurred in the states, and the Fed, whatever, since 1962, as before 1960, all the years before, because most of the people exist now as opposed to before. Population is, since 1962 has, I think, at least quadrupled. So anyway, so I would say the sparingly proclaimment by the Supreme Court in 1977 and Ingraham, Wright, has simply been met by time, which means it's time for a novel argument. If one duplicates an argument within Robinson, as was done in Powell, one is simply not using everything that one could use. So Robinson had to do with status and condition. It just had to do with addiction, right? It's just one kind of cruel and unusual punishment type, third tier, right? This vast wasteland of possibilities of what could be cruel and unusual punishment by lawmaking. As mentioned earlier, if you have monkeys typing randomly at keyboards, they could produce some pretty bad laws that would kill a lot of people if they complied with the laws. Complying with laws can kill you, right? It could induce a hazardous condition upon society. Very hazardous conditions could be imposed upon society by lawmaking. We know this because lawmaking induces, well, supposedly, imports a good kind of health and human welfare upon society. And if one just simply changes all of the acts to be the opposite in each and every extant law, one gets people doing the opposite of what the laws are meant to do now. And this would cause havoc and kill a lot of people. So laws can, random lawmaking can induce hazardous conditions upon society. So therefore, there ought to be restrictions on the kinds of laws, on lawmaking, right? There should be legislative restrictions imposed by the Constitution, and there are. I mean, the First Amendment is, you know, Congress shall make no law which blah 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 violates First Amendment rights. The 14th Amendment, Privileges and Immunities Act, is no state shall make or impose or enforce any law, blah blah blah, which violates the privileges and immunities of the citizens of the United States, which has been interpreted to be people of the United States, even people visiting the United States, not only the citizenry. The privileges and immunities of the United States, which, by the way, nobody knows what they are now. They used to know. There was a Coriel versus case from 1828. Was it Coriel versus Cor? No, I'm thinking Korchak. That's not right. Corfield versus Coriel. Okay, there we go. Clearly, enumerated certain privileges and immunities enjoyed by the people of the United States. Later, the slaughterhouse cases messed things up. And now, I'm not sure what things are privileges or immunities protected by the Constitution, right? The right to work used to be one of them, but it's no longer. Other things come under just simply due process fundamental rights, which, by the way, are not as tightly protected as the privileges and immunities. If it were used, because there are privileges and immunities, as best of my knowledge, have no limiting principles. While the government certainly can limit fundamental human rights, all it needs is a compelling interest, which is narrowly tailored, meaning legislated in a certain proper way, and which is also least restrictive, being of these rights. It doesn't it violates these rights very carefully. The government can violate your rights and ought to be able to violate your rights to adjust to emergent conditions, and the Constitution allows this under due process. So anyway, getting back to the vast wasteland of laws and the novel argument that I have. Okay, I'm just rambling on. I have to go really soon. So here it is. So basically, people shouldn't be allowed to torture themselves, to instructed be torturers to themselves. The government shouldn't be able to make laws constitutionally, which requires people to torture themselves in order to comply with the law. All right, like, people ought to have the same rights that pets do. In all 50 states, it's animal cruelty to not provide your pet shelter. And I said all 50 states, that's not true. The state of Hawaii actually doesn't have the word shelter. The state of Georgia doesn't. So the ratio is more like it's like there's 3 states which have exceptions. And there's a book on animal rights in which it says that it actually quotes the legislature from Hawaii, where it actually intends for animals to be protected from the elements. And the word was just left out of the law. So precedent in Hawaii, I think, you're not allowed to not shelter your animal in Hawaii. I think, even though These words are not expressly within the animal rights law of Hawaii. They are in 47 states. They are in California, Colorado, California too. I live in Colorado, but they are in Colorado. You must provide your pet with adequate shelter to protect it from the elements according to its kind. So, if you don't, it's animal cruelty. Okay, so if it's cruel to an animal not to provide its shelter, it's cruel to a human being. Human beings don't have fur, animals do. So, therefore, it is cruel to make a law which expressly forbids the use of shelter for human beings. This law protects animals, but it doesn't protect homeless people. This state, rather, protects animals. It treats homeless people worse than animals. It makes it illegal for them to use shelter, but that's cruel. We already saw that. It's cruel to animal. It's cruel to human being. So that means that it imposes pre-convicted punishment because cruelty is punishing. It's imposing animal cruelty upon human beings. In Fort Collins, the Fort Collins City Ordinance 17181 imposes animal cruelty upon human beings. And, well, that's ought to fall under the Eighth Amendment's cruel and unusual punishment clause. Well, it can't certainly fall under the first two tiers because the first two tiers, by precedent, have been ruled. The kind of punishment that's cruel and unusual punishment the Eighth Amendment is talking about is post-convicted punishment. There's a balancing act between pre-convicted punishment, which I'm defining here to be very rare, but in this case, it clearly exists, as we've just established, that this law requires animal cruelty to human beings, which is punishing. It requires this, it demands it, versus post-convicted punishment, which is how laws are incentivized, right? So there's a very strong disincentivization here because complying with the law is worse than the worst possible punishment that the law imposes upon the populace. Because not complying with the law, complying with the law means suicide for a vast swath of the year, at least 300 days of the year in Fort Collins here, or at least 250 days of the year, definitely during the winter. It's still 5 degrees out right now, and it is 8:55 in the morning. You just got to use bedding, camping gear, or shelter if you're outdoors right now, right? If you spent the night, right? Um, so it's cruel to an animal. It's animal cruelty not to provide animals with adequate shelter. It's a law. So it's cruel to human beings who don't have fur. Human beings do not have fur to impose the same, um, kind of conditions upon them. You must shelter human beings. So, it's also torture. If you look up Wikipedia, exposure to the elements is torture. So, the government ought to be restricted against making laws which torture its populace, which calls for the populace to torture itself. As I was referring to earlier with the state people model about how societies work. Societies have a kind of intelligence imposed upon them by this vast network of laws, just like ant societies and mimosa plants and the wood wide web, about how animal plant ecosystems behave intelligently despite the fact that each plant is really dumb. But most plant is a little bit smarter than most plants. All plants respond to their environments in adaptive ways, which can be construed to be problem solving activities. So all plants have sort of minimal kind of intelligence. But no plant is smart enough to solve the kind of eco societal problems that they need to. And the same with us. I mean, these laws impose intelligence upon our societies. And even though each of us are individually very intelligent, it can't be said that we could solve all of society's problems. Well, I mean, to such an extent as has already been done by ourselves. We can't keep track of every city, every person, every city, whatever. So laws are important. They're very important to orchestrate society's behavior in adaptive, meaningful ways such that they cohere over time instead of factioning into fractional elements which tend to uh, destroy each other. So anyway, that's my novel argument. Um, it has to do with if it's cruel to an animal, it's cruel to a human being. Animals are protected by law. It's animal cruelty not to provide animals with shelter. And yet we are not allowed to provide ourselves with shelter. So that's it. I mean, I could go on more and talk about the vast wasteland of this Ingraham Wright, which is supposed to be used. Ingraham Wright third pronounced it. Cruel and unusual punishment imposes substantive limits on what can be made criminal and punished as such. But anyway, I don't, and I could talk about information theory, which is central to the way things like communication theory should be analyzed. And you know, hey, it's not these freaking French philosophers who didn't come up with anything new because they had no freaking idea that certain scientific principles existed. They had no understanding of these scientific principles, like, say, Sluice or like, um, the principle that this supposedly novel philosophical idea from this douchebag French philosopher that words are symbols. Of course, they're symbols. There's the trace, which is the thing represented by the symbol, right? Well, the thing represented by the symbol, right? And we're talking about, infinite regression. This French philosopher, that words have no meaning, and the only meaning of words is in reference to other words. Totally ignores the field of psychology and child psychology about what meaning actually is inside of a human brain. Of course, that's didn't exist back then, but meaning is an intensely personal experience. And the fact that two people can agree upon a meaning has nothing to do with the fact that they're defined the same way in the dictionary. People get meaning before they're able to read, and once they're able to read, they rarely find meaning by referring to dictionaries. That only starts happening around the age of 7, 8, or whatever, and it becomes more significant once one gets older to discover meaning that way. So anyway, I'm just going to go. Have a good day. Bye. Ugh.